Scott William Ritter Jr. was born on July 15, 1961, in Gainesville, Florida, into the kind of American family that moves when the government tells it to move. His father was an Air Force officer. His mother was a military nurse. That matters, because the first atmosphere Ritter ever breathed was not civilian life. It was discipline, hierarchy, duty, and the quiet assumption that the state is real, permanent, and serious. He grew up across postings, absorbing the mentality of an empire that sees the world in maps, threat envelopes, and mission briefs. He attended an American high school in Germany and graduated in 1979. By the time he became a young man, the Cold War wasn't theory. It was the background music of daily life, and he was being shaped to serve inside it. In college at Franklin and Marshall in Pennsylvania, Ritter gravitated towards Soviet history and the Russian language. He wasn't studying Russia as a tourist. He studied it like an opponent. He learned to think in systems, ideology, propaganda, intelligence operations, the psychology of states, and the way empires justify violence with words. That mental framework would later define his entire public life, because once you've been trained to read the world like an intelligence officer, it's hard to ever go back to reading it like an ordinary citizen. Ritter entered the U.S. military world as a young man, and by the mid-1980s, he was commissioned as an intelligence officer in the United States Marine Corps. He developed a reputation for intensity and initiative, an officer who didn't just follow checklists, but pushed boundaries, sometimes making superiors uneasy because he wasn't satisfied with good enough. He wanted the real picture. In military culture, that kind of personality can rise quickly when results are needed, but it can also create enemies because it threatens the comfort of routine. In 1988, he landed what many young intelligence officers would have considered the dream assignment: arms control work tied to US-Soviet agreements during the final years of the Cold War. This period is important because it created a permanent contradiction inside him. Arms control is not just politics, it's verification. It's the war between what governments claim and what inspectors can prove. It teaches you a brutal lesson. Powerful states lie when it benefits them, even when the subject is existential. During that time, Ritter met Marina Katiashvili, a translator from the Soviet Union, who later became his wife. They married in 1991 and had twin daughters. His personal life, marriage, children, and the responsibilities of adulthood developed in parallel with his professional life inside the most secretive dimensions of state power. That combination can harden a person. It can also make them obsessively protective of their own moral identity, because when you work around deception long enough, you either become a cynic or you become someone who tries to prove you're not the liar. Then came the Gulf War. In 1991, as a Marine officer, Ritter served as a ballistic missile intelligence analyst during Operation Desert Storm. This is where he first collided publicly with a Central American habit, declaring victory with confidence that goes beyond what evidence can support. He disputed claims about how many Iraqi mobile Scud launchers had been destroyed, arguing that the evidence didn't justify the triumphant narrative. That may sound technical, but it reveals the core trait that would define him. He does not merely argue politics. He argues verification. He argues receipts. He argues what can be proven. Soon after the war, Ritter stepped into history. He joined the United Nations Special Commission, the UN body tasked with finding and dismantling Iraq's weapons of mass destruction programs after the Gulf War. From 1991 through 1998, he became one of the most aggressive, relentless inspectors on the ground, leading numerous inspection missions, pushing for access, pushing timelines, pushing confrontations, Inspectors like Ritter were not just bureaucrats. They were human pressure tools. They were designed to stress a regime until the regime either complied or revealed the shape of its deception. And Iraq fought back. Iraqi officials accused inspectors of spying. The regime blocked access. The UN Security Council argued internally. The United States and Britain had their own priorities. And Ritter found himself in the middle of a machine where everyone had motives that did not always align with disarmament. To him, inspections were supposed to be the honest layer between war and peace. But in the late 1990s, he increasingly claimed that inspections were being politically manipulated, that intelligence agencies were using UN mechanisms for purposes that went beyond disarmament, and that the Security Council was not enforcing its own resolutions in a coherent way. In August 1998, Ritter resigned from UNSCOM, publicly, dramatically, and with a message that detonated inside Washington. The inspection mission, he argued, was being undermined and used in ways that corrupted its purpose. This is the psychological hinge in his life. Because after that resignation, Ritter did something that turned him into a national controversy. He shifted from inspector warning about Iraqi deception to inspector warning about American deception. He became a vocal critic of the momentum toward war, and he challenged the claim that Iraq posed an imminent weapons threat. He warned that the WMD narrative was being inflated, politicized, and weaponized to justify invasion. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 and did not find stockpiles of WMD in the way the public had been told, Ritter's reputation split into two permanently opposing realities. To supporters, he became a rare figure, an insider who had told the truth before the catastrophe happened. To critics, he became something else, a man who attacked US policy, appeared on controversial platforms, and eventually drifted into a public role that looked less like analysis and more like ideological warfare. Ritter did not disappear after Iraq. He wrote books, he gave talks, he built a media presence. He argued that the war was sold through deception and that the national security state had poisoned the relationship between government and truth. His tone was often confrontational, sometimes moralistic, sometimes prophetic. He did not behave like a cautious academic. He behaved like a man who believed he had stared into the engine room of history and saw something rotten. And then came the second life-defining collision, the one that has no clean redemption arc. In the early 2000s, Ritter faced a police sting case involving communications with someone he believed to be a minor. That case ended with charges dismissed and sealed. Later, in 2009, he was arrested again in a separate sting operation involving online communications with a person authorities said was posing as a minor. In 2011, he was convicted on sex-related charges and sentenced to prison time. He served time and was later paroled. You cannot tell his biography honestly without that, because it fundamentally reshaped how the public interpreted everything else about him. For many people, it destroyed his credibility permanently. For others, it became part of a broader belief that he was targeted because of his political positions. Ritter himself has argued variations of that idea publicly, framing his legal downfall as connected to forces that wanted him silenced. This is where his story becomes mind-bending in the most uncomfortable way. Not because it's mysterious, but because it forces you to confront how modern society processes truth. A person can be right about a world historic event and still be morally broken. A person can possess real expertise and still destroy their own legitimacy. A person can be both an analyst of power and an example of personal collapse. In the years after prison, Ritter re-emerged into the media ecosystem that thrives on polarization. He increasingly appeared in alternative outlets and foreign-facing media spaces, particularly as US-Russia tensions escalated. He positioned himself as an American dissenter, criticizing NATO expansion, criticizing Washington's foreign policy, criticizing what he called the myth-making function of Western media. When the Russia-Ukraine war exploded into full-scale conflict in 2022, Ritter became one of the most visible American voices arguing against mainstream Western narratives. He presented himself as a realist, insisting that war outcomes are determined by industrial capacity, logistics, and strategic depth, not by inspirational slogans. Supporters saw brutal honesty. Critics saw apologetics for Russian aggression. Either way, he became what he always seemed destined to become: a man living inside the storm of interpretation. Not simply what happened, but what does it mean, and who gets to decide? Then came another modern twist. The state's attention returned. In 2024, his home was raided by the FBI as part of an investigation the public couldn't fully see, and he publicly discussed the seizure of his passport and travel restrictions, framing it as punishment for his speech and his foreign media connections. Again, to supporters, this looked like intimidation. To critics, this looked like law enforcement responding to a controversial figure's foreign ties. The public, as always, was left to interpret the silhouette, rather than the full body of facts. Now add the layer you asked for: religion stances. Ritter is not primarily known as a religious teacher, and he has not built a conventional public identity around belonging to a specific faith tradition in the way some public intellectuals do. But he does speak about religion as a civilizational force, and he often frames global conflict through religious and moral language, especially when discussing the Middle East, Israel, and the broader Judeo-Christian cultural framework in the West. In various public appearances, he has also spoken with explicit respect about Islam and about Muslims he has worked with, emphasizing that religion and people are not reducible to propaganda labels. The key point is this: his public relationship to religion appears less like devotion and more like interpretation. He treats religion as history, identity, moral architecture, and a weapon used by states and movements to mobilize populations. That makes his commentary emotionally potent because it speaks to the deep layer underneath politics: why humans obey, why humans kill, and why humans accept narratives that flatter them. This is also why he can be so persuasive. He doesn't only talk about tanks and treaties, he talks about meaning, and meaning is what most audiences actually crave. So what is the full blueprint of Scott Ritter, from start to now? He is a military-raised American who learned early that states operate by power, not by purity. He is an intelligence officer trained to search for what is hidden, not what is announced. He is an arms control inspector who lived inside the machinery that decides whether the world goes to war. He is a dissenter who became famous because he challenged the narrative of Iraq's WMD and was later validated by the absence of the promised stockpiles. He is also a man whose personal crimes and legal conviction created a permanent stain that many people will never separate from his political speech. He is a commentator whose later work placed him in the center of the most explosive information war of the modern era: the fight over Russia, NATO, Ukraine, and the legitimacy of Western power. If you want the most timeless way to understand him, it's this: Scott Ritter is not a clean hero story. He is a case study in how truth and ruin can occupy the same body. He shows you something that modern audiences hate to admit. Being correct about geopolitics does not make someone good. Being anti-war does not automatically make someone moral. Having access to secrets does not automatically make someone trustworthy. And being condemned by the mainstream does not automatically make someone a martyr. His life forces a more mature, more uncomfortable form of intelligence. Because if you can hold two realities in your mind at once, his expertise and his downfall, his warnings and his crimes, his insight and his contradictions, then you are thinking like the world actually works. That's why he remains so polarizing, and why he remains so fascinating. Scott Ritter's story is not only about Iraq, or Russia, or inspections, or media. It is about the war between narratives and verification. It is about what happens to a person who builds their identity on being the one who sees through the lies, and then becomes trapped in a life where people can always say, "But what about you?" And it is about the terrifying modern fact that once you become a symbol, hero to one side, villain to the other, you may never again be treated as a human being with a complicated timeline. You become a weapon, a talking point, a proof of somebody else's worldview. And that may be the final, mind-bending twist of his biography. The man who built his public life exposing propaganda became a permanent object inside propaganda. By the way, don't forget to hit like and subscribe button. Also, write us in the comments what you think about Scott Ritter. We'd love to hear your thoughts.